All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm here today with Marcus. Now, welcome, Marcus. Let me start off there. I
Yeah, thanks for
appreciate,
having me. Thanks for having me, Michael.
yeah, I appreciate you taking time to do this. Um, I met Marcus. I went to the APA earlier this year. We both did. That's where we met. And I was telling a few friends of mine, Marcus, afterwards that it's like the quintessential philosophy conference experience. Like
hmm
you go there having certain expectations, and there's always that one presentation paper that just like completely throws you off. And for me, yours was that paper and presentation. Like I was completely like befuddled, I guess is the right word. It's like, what is this? What's happening here?
Cool.
So, Marcus, how about you start off telling us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and the
Sure.
areas of philosophy you're interested in?
Yeah, sure. I'm currently an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Tampa. Um, Before that, I taught for a year at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And in 2008, I got my doctorate in philosophy with a minor in cognitive science from the University of Arizona. Before that, I did my undergraduate at Tufts University, just outside of Boston, with Dan Dennett, and that's how I got into philosophy and cognitive science. My work generally focuses in many different areas of philosophy. I did my doctoral dissertation on social and political philosophy, on justice, but I also do work on AI consciousness and on AI ethics, which is a huge thing right now, on how to align AI with our values and control them to make sure that they don't kill us all. And then I obviously do this work in simulation theory. It's related to it as well.
Yeah, I was looking through some of your writing, and it's interesting to me. One of the things I was mostly curious about is what kind of there seems to be and maybe they're more connected than I think they are, but
Mhm.
you have a lot of work on free will and sort of the cognitive side of things, philosophy of mind, kind of generally speaking. And then there's this like slight turn to AI, maybe philosophy
Mhm.
of technology, and then this simulation argument. So, was there something that caused that, or was it just something you were always interested in but never really had time to explore?
I think it was two things. So partly it was a matter of luck. So I teach at the University of Tampa, which is a really small department. And so I teach a lot of different types of classes. And so it just exposes me to many different areas of philosophical thought. And it encouraged me to find connections between them. But more generally, over the years, I've sort of developed an approach to philosophy that at least aims to resolve, to grapple with, I think, some of the problems of philosophical methodologies, right? So, of course, one of the frustrating things about philosophy, both to students and to some philosophers, is like, you know, for every topic, whether it's consciousness or free will or justice and so on, if there's a position out there that some philosopher can defend, like there is some philosopher who defends that view. And so you've got like all of these different theories, right? And everybody who defends each theory thinks their theory is defensible. And they think the other guy or the other side, that their theory is wrong, right? And the problem, of course, is that unlike science, where we have a clear methodology to resolve differences, right? In philosophy, it's just the arguments. And so people are led into all different kinds of directions. And so one of the things that's always motivated me is the idea that philosophy should seek truth, right?
Mm.
Like science. And to seek truth, we have to have a good methodology that doesn't just base our arguments on how things seem to us, right? So by thinking this through, I was very attracted to a naturalistic approach to philosophy and the idea that we should try to reduce and explain philosophical problems, right, in a sort of broadly scientific way, right? And in science, there are many different aims that scientists try to do, but like one really common one is the aim of theoretical unification, right? So we try to, reduce biology to chemistry, and we try to reduce chemistry to physics, and so that we can have a kind of unified picture of the world that all kind of fits together in a way that makes sense, right? And so that's really what I'm trying to do. When I do moral and political philosophy, I'm trying to develop an account that is grounded in, empirical moral psychology and what we know about the human being, right? And our values and interests and the ways that we deliberate when it comes to, issues of, quantum mechanics and physics. I want to say, how can we explain these phenomena in some kind of deeper way that will give them a deeper naturalistic explanation than they currently have, right? And so that's my general kind of methodological orientation, and why when I spread out into these different areas of philosophy and science, I'm doing that, right? Because I'm trying to see how reality fits together in an empirically defensible way that is philosophically enlightening.
Yeah, I'm glad you outlined that, because it relates to a larger point that I had when I read your paper on the peer-to-peer hypothesis, which I'll link in the description of this video, along with Marcus's other links that he has provided. So let's move into the simulation argument. And I was wondering, to kind of start off, if you can provide us with, because when I think of the simulation argument, I think of Bostrom, which I think Nick Bostrom, which I think is probably the best known example of that. So can we start off with kind of a general framing of what the simulation argument is, and then from there kind of transition into your particular version?
Yeah. So Bostrom's argument, right, is just a pure sort of probabilistic sort of reasoning from the armchair, right? And the argument goes something like this. He assumes what he calls substrate independence, right? So that like digital creatures could, at least in principle, be conscious, right? So they could have consciousness like we do. And this is based broadly on a theory of philosophy of mind called functionalism, which is like, anything that carries out mental functions like sight, hearing, and thinking, thereby has those things, right? So if digital creatures or AI could, carry out all of our brain functions, then those creatures would be conscious. And so Bostrom's basic argument goes like this, right? So it's possible to create digital universes, right? Digital realities. And it may even be possible for, creatures in digital universes to create digital universes inside of their digital universes, simulations inside of simulations. And then the idea is, well, look, there can only be one base reality, one non-simulated reality, like by definition. Like anything that is simulated has to, at some level, be grounded in some ultimate reality, of which there can only be one. And Bostrom says, well, look, right, it's likely at some future point, on the assumption that humanity doesn't go extinct, that some post-human civilization many years from now would create vastly many simulations that are highly detailed, just like our world. And so the idea is, since the creatures in those simulations would be conscious, and there can only be one real reality, then the probability that we live in a simulation right now is extraordinarily high, right? Because the vast majority of realities in which there are conscious creatures are simulated ones, and there can again only be one real reality. So chances are we ourselves are in one of the simulated ones. That's the basic idea behind Bostrom's argument. I have problems with that argument, and many people have raised questions about Bostrom's reasoning about the probabilities and his assumptions that that digital creatures could even be conscious in the first place. I actually have a recent paper sort of even trying to cast doubt on that particular assumption of his. So I try to come at the simulation argument from a quite different perspective.
Yeah, let's start to unpack that, because how you explained it, I can theoretically understand the kind of the general structure of Bostrom's argument. And it's fun as a thought experiment. But some of the things that you said during your presentation and the brief conversation that we had afterwards, there's good reasons to believe that this is not like simply a thought experiment, that there's this explains some features of reality that you point out. So however you want to proceed there, what is your version of that simulation argument?
Yeah. Okay. So my version of the simulation argument is that there's a certain kind of simulation, right? A peer-to-peer network simulation, where there isn't any kind of central computer that is, or so I argue, capable of explaining quantum mechanics, right? The fundamental quantum features of our world. And the reason why I argue that this is a better way to defend the simulation argument is as follows. So there are these deep mysteries at the heart of physics, right? So, when scientists study the microphysical world, they find that it has all of these really bizarre features in experiments. So there's like the double slit experiment, where it suggests that light particles are somehow waves at the same time as being located at, in an individual position, like a point particle, right? And depending on how you carry out the double slit experiment, the light will either behave like a wave, which is spread out in space, or it will be localized, right? Always going through one slit or the other. And quantum mechanics tells us that in some sense, every particle in the world is multiply located, right? Until we measure it, or until there's a measurement taken, at which point the particle collapses, the wave function, and is observed as having a determinate value. And so all of this seems really baffling. Like, how could our world be this way? And is there any deeper explanation of why our world is this way? Mm-hmm. And the basic idea of the peer-to-peer simulation hypothesis that I've developed is that quantum mechanics, right, this kind of behavior in our world emerges naturally from the functional structure of a peer-to-peer simulation, right? So here's how it works, right? In a peer-to-peer simulation, consider a game, an online video game like Gears of War, right? So there you are sitting in your living room, and your game console represents, right, what's going on in front of your character for you, right? So you shoot a gun at another character. Your console represents where the bullet is after you shoot it. But of course, there are other people, dozens or hundreds of people playing the game in their living room. And their game also represents where your bullet is located when you fired it. Now, in a peer-to-peer simulation, there's no central computer that defines where the bullet actually is. All there is are the different computers on the network, each of which is always representing the bullet as being somewhere, but they're not always representing it as being in exactly the same place, because there's informational distance between them, right? So my console has to send you information about where the bullet is. Your console has to send me information about where the bullet is, and so on. So when we think about the functional structure of a peer-to-peer simulation, it turns out that it has the features of quantum mechanics that our world has, right? So the bullet really is in many places at once. It's in one place on your computer, another place on my computer, another place on Jones's computer, another place on Smith's computer. And yet, whenever we measure it, whenever I measure it on my computer, I always detect it as being at one spot. And whenever you measure it, you detect it as being at one spot, which is to say that in a peer-to-peer simulation, right, objects are located in many spots at once, like a wave, but they're also always measured as being at one spot in particular by any person, like a particle. And so there's a natural wave particle duality in peer-to-peer networks, right? Any simulation that runs this way will give rise to quantum phenomena just like we experience it in our reality. And the idea is, well, since physics doesn't have any explanation about why our world is this way, the best explanation of why our world is this way, why our world is quantum mechanical, is that we do live in a peer-to-peer simulation. Like, that's the most natural explanation of what's going on. And then the final idea is, look, explanatory arguments like this are why we believe many things that we believe today. So, for example, I take it that everyone watching this video believes that the Earth and planets revolve around the sun, right? So, before Copernicus, it was believed that all the planets and heavens revolve around the Earth, right? Why do people believe that the Earth revolves around the sun? Well, the answer is, it's not, right, that we have sort of uniquely determinate observations that prove it one way or the other. As Stephen Hawking wrote in The Grand Design, actually, both the pre-Copernican view that everything revolves around the Earth and the post-Copernican view that everything in the the solar system revolves around the sun, can both be reconciled with observation, right? There are ways of making them consistent with observation. I mean, if you just think about the theory of relativity, where motion is relative to an observer, there is a sense in which you can understand, right, objects as revolving around the Earth from the reference frame of the Earth. On the other hand, if you adopt the reference frame of the sun, then the explanation is that things revolve around the sun. So why do we believe the latter? It's that Copernicus's explanation is simply a better explanation, right? It's simpler. It just gives a single law of gravity that explains why all the planets move as they do around the sun. And so we believe that hypothesis because it's a better explanation of the data than the pre-Copernican view, which is a bad explanation of the data. And so by a similar token, my argument is like, look, right, we need to somehow explain the quantum mechanical features of our world. And if the best explanation is that we live in a peer-to-peer simulation, then we should believe that we do live in a peer-to-peer simulation as it being the best explanation of the data.
As I was reading this, what came to mind, and based off of what you just said, you kind of started us off talking about what I would call like your general kind of logical approach, logical framework that you're using for this. You talked about theoretical unification in the role that plays in science. And if I could, it seems like what's happening here, like when I look at this, I'm kind of viewing it in the same way as like now there is a big difference, but I'm viewing it in the same way as like a scientific theory. So, and what I mean by that is, so you take something like Newton's theory of gravity, and the reason why Newton's explanation, the system that he provides in his principles of mathematics, the reason why it's so powerful in terms of the explanation that it provides is because it united all of these seemingly disconnected pieces of reality.
Exactly.
Right. So Newton was able to provide a single theory that brought together and explained motion that happens on Earth, the apple falling from the tree, as well as the motions that's going on in space, the planets revolving around the sun in a unified system. So what really stood out to me about what you're doing, and I like it because I think I could see what you're trying to do here, and it makes sense, is you're pointing out all of these aspects of reality that quantum mechanics has identified, that is in some way, shape, or form mysterious, for lack of a better word, or just odd features of reality, quantum superposition, quantum indeterminacy, the quantum measurement problem. You identify several of these, and you take all these and you say that we have all of these features, and then of course we have philosophical things too, such as the nature of time and issues regarding time. And you say that what brings all of this, or what could bring all of this together, what best explains all of this, what fits it all into a neat little package is the peer-to-peer hypothesis.
Right.
First of all, did I get that right?
You did get it right. And there are other features of physics and quantum mechanics that I sort of left out of that discussion too. So, one issue of the microphysical world that's extremely baffling too is what's called the Planck length, right? And the Planck length is this like very, very small, right? A length below which, according to the equations of quantum mechanics and relativity, space and time make no sense, right? The laws, as it were, break down. That's sort of puzzling. Why would our world be that way? But of course, and here's another thing, right? So the great insight of quantum mechanics is that all energy in our universe is emitted and sent in discrete packets, or quanta, right? One packet at a time. Now, let's think about peer-to-peer networking. So how does it actually work, right? Well, my computer in a peer-to-peer network sends packets of information, right? And they contain, each packet contains a location of where your character is located, what direction they're facing, what the speed they're moving. And they're sent in discrete small packets that are separated from one another. So not only will everything in a peer-to-peer simulation thereby be quantized, right? But also because there is space between the packets, there will be distances below which there is no value, right, for where something is located in space or time, which, of course, just is akin to the Planck length in our universe. Now, if we even move beyond quantum mechanics to relativity, right? Relativity tells us several bizarre things about our world, right? One is that there is a maximum speed limit, right? The speed of light, that information, right, can propagate through the universe. Now, a computer programmer by the name of Eric Grange, right, published something based on my theory saying, like, look, right, any peer-to-peer network, due to bandwidth limitations, like how quickly, right, information can be sent over the internet between computers, is thereby going to have a maximum speed limit that information can propagate in the simulated world that those characters are representing. Otherwise, it's not going to be a well-formed world where the information makes sense. So there has to be something like a speed limit, like the speed of light in a peer-to-peer network. We also think about the fact that every node in the network, my computer in my living room, your computer in your living room, represents the world differently, right? Mm-hmm. We can also see that there's a sense in which time will have to be relative to each observer in the network, because every computer has its own internal clock at which things are moving for the observer. And of course, Einstein's theory shows us, right, that space and time are relative. But if that is also a natural feature of a peer-to-peer network, that every user, every computer has its own unique reference frame, right, then we can explain those aspects of physics as well, right, in a way that currently has no deeper explanation.
Yeah, and that's another aspect that I like about this is not only are you not only are you addressing this as an explanation for the why of a lot of features of quantum mechanics, this also touches other areas of philosophy, specifically, philosophy of mind, philosophy of time, and then some other ideas such as the holographic principle and multiverse hypothesis that I want to come back to. But so what you just said carries implications for like the philosophy of time, for example. So how does what you just said relate to these other, which might seem like seemingly unconnected areas, such as the philosophy of time? Like, what would this tell us about the philosophy of time, for example?
Well, good. So once again, there's a plurality of views in the philosophy of time about what it is, right? Yeah. So on the one hand, right, just to start simply, right, if we think about the metaphysics of time, right, there's this kind of necessary connection view, right, that what occurs in one point in time causes or in some way brings about a later point in time. It has a kind of causal oomphiness, time and causation being related to one another, right? Previous times cause later times. But there's also what's called this Humean view, where we should understand time as being just a sequence, right? Like pictures in a film strip, where time is just one moment followed by another moment followed by another moment. And so how should we decide between which of those theories is right? Is there some kind of intrinsic time that is moving, right, called the A theory of time? Or is time sort of just a series of events one after another, like a film strip, called the B theory of time? And A theorists and B theorists have debated about this to no end. Wait, there's no clear resolution, right? So there are further theories about what's the ontology of time, right? So like one view called presentism is that only the present really exists, right? The past and future, they don't exist yet in any sense. Then there's a view called eternalism, which is that no, the past, present, and future all in some sense eternally, right? And some people argue that, science supports this kind of eternalist view of time, and some people argue philosophy supports it. Okay. Then finally, there's what's called the moving spotlight theory of time. And the moving spotlight theory of time combines both of these pictures, right? It says, well, in some way, time, the past, present, and future, all exist eternally. But that but the present is kind of like a spotlight, right? That's shining in on the present moment and that's moving across the timeline, right, towards the future. So there are philosophical arguments for each of these views, but one question is, right, could the peer-to-peer simulation hypothesis illuminate which of those theories is more likely to be true? And I think it can. So if we think about how video games work, right? So let's go back a little bit because I think this is a helpful image. Go back in history. Games like in a PlayStation, written on a DVD or a Blu-ray disc, right? So what's on the Blu-ray disc or the DVD disc, right? Just series of digital information, right? But what are those series of digital information? What they are in the game is they are possible past, present, and future conditions that any character in the game can occupy, right? Mm-hmm. So when you play the game, your controller, right, controls which series in that data on the disk is experienced by you as being in the present, mm-hmm. right? So from the standpoint of how a game works, right, any video game that's networked, there is in some sense, right, a manner in which different possible past, presents, and futures all exist timelessly, like eternalism says, right? Because there is a sense in which when you play the game, you can go into one past or present or future in the game. There's also a sense, right, in which there is a determinate present when you play the game, right? The DVD reader, the spotlight, reads where you are in the game at that particular instant. So if this is right, if our world is something like a peer-to-peer network simulation, then we do have a good reason to subscribe to the moving spotlight account of time. There's a sense in which past, present, and future, and alternative past, presents, and futures really all do exist, like the multiverse idea. But also that given that while we're playing the game right now, we're living it, that there is in fact a spotlight, right? That is connecting, right, every person's perspective playing the game at a particular point in that data stream on the game disk, so to speak.
Right. Okay. So if the peer-to-peer hypothesis is true, then we would prefer, or it would be more likely the case that the moving spotlight is correct, is the view of time. So it provides a way to give a more concrete answer to these issues. And
actually, can I add something real quick?
Please.
There's also a sense in which, from a functional perspective, right? So one of the deepest metaphysical questions that philosophers have is the monism versus dualism debate. Like, is there just one thing, namely the physical universe? Or are there two things, the physical universe and the mind, right? Or the soul? Mm-hmm. Now, if we think about how video games work, right, there's a sense in which they're monistic, right? So everything that's operating in your PlayStation is a mechanism, right? So you've got the game disc with the data on it, and then you've got the reader that is reading the game disc and processing it through a computer processor. Now, all of that is ultimately one type of substance, right? But if you think about how it's functioning, it does have a kind of dualistic feature to it because the disk is being read by a separate device, right? So you've got the data on the disk, but in order for it to be presented to someone from a perspective, that data has to be read by a measuring device, namely the computer processor. And so there's a manner in which, right, the structure of a peer-to-peer simulation, even if it's at root, right, a single type of substance, a physical substance, a physical mechanism, it can give rise to, right, through its functional structure, a kind of dualism, right, where the reader's perspective, right, is unique to that reader, and other readers on the network who have their own game console will read the same data from a different perspective, and those perspectives will seem irreducible to the data on the disk, just like our consciousness seems irreducible to the physical world around us.
Mm-hmm. Good. So yeah, this has like connections again to other areas of philosophy, specifically philosophy of mind, and you tie in issues such as the problem of identity as well as your theory of free will into this. So can you explain kind of how what does this have to do with dualism and the mind-body problem? Yeah.
All right, awesome. So anybody who's thought about the simulation hypothesis knows that there's two possibilities, right? One possibility is that, and this is what Bostrom focuses, is that we are simulated creatures ourselves. We are just digital creatures, right, contained in a simulation. That's one possibility. The other possibility is the one that's in the Matrix movie, where, right, people outside of the simulation, real flesh and blood people, are hooked up to a simulation. So they're not themselves simulations, right? They're real people, but they're hooked up to a simulation. They're imprisoned by, right, the evil machines in the Matrix world. Which of those possibilities do I think is more defensible, right, or more likely given our evidence? So the science, right, of the world around us, right, tells us that everything is quantized or digital, so to speak. But, and this relates to a couple papers that I've published recently, consciousness, right? Our consciousness doesn't appear to be digital at all, right? Our consciousness fundamentally appears to be analog, right? So, you know, consider the color red and shading into the color orange, shading into the color yellow, right? There's this clear continuum of change of color. The experience of color is not on and off like 5 volts versus 0 volts, right? It's not just on or off like a digital circuit. Rather, right, our conscious experience, right, appears to be analog. It changes in continuous degree along certain qualities, right? So red looks a certain way and can shade into a different quality, orange, which can shade into a different quality, yellow. And so if this is right, there's a sense in which our conscious experience, our perspective, really is fundamentally different than everything that science tells us about the world outside of consciousness, including our physical brains, which it says is all quantized, right? So that suggests that if we do live in a peer-to-peer network, right, it's the Matrix case, where we, in some way, at the higher level outside of this simulation, we live in an analog reality, right, where our consciousness or whatever bodies we have, right, is fundamentally analog and not digital. Now, do we have free will, right, in that, you know, in that higher realm, which we, right, is not accessible to us in our reference frame, right? Our reference frame, whether we're trapped here by evil machines like in the Matrix, we can't know. All we know is what we can experience in our reference frame. So how would we know? Right? So we do have some evidence, I think, that if we're in a peer-to-peer simulation, at the higher level, we are somehow analog agents outside of the simulation. So in that higher physics, outside of the simulation that's analog, do we have free will? How do we determine that? I don't know if there's a proof, but one way of thinking about it is like this. Right? So when I was a little kid, I really liked to play the video game Pac-Man, right? And I don't know if your character is a little guy that runs around a maze eating little dots, and you try to escape from ghosts. Now, let's think about how events in a Pac-Man world, right? And think about the physics of a Pac-Man world. Just about everything in a Pac-Man world is determined by the algorithm, right, of the game itself, right? So, right, all of the little dots will flash because that's what they're programmed to do, right? All of the ghosts that chase your guy around will follow according to the algorithms of the game. Now, there's one part of the game, though, that doesn't obey the algorithm, right? What part is that?
The user, right?
It's you, the user. Yeah. You're controlling it from the outside, right? So, you know, if we sort of extend the thought experiment a little more, if there were like Pac-Man scientists in the game, right? They might think that there's no free will. Everything's determined because when they measure all the ghosts and whatnot, they all seem to be determined by the laws of physics of the world. But now if they were to look really carefully at our behavior as the user, they would see that that's not determinable by the physics of the world that they're observing. And they would infer something like, there's got to be a user outside of our world that is causing this person to disobey the probabilistic laws of how the ghosts behave. So suppose, right now, our scientists have studied what's called the quantum wave function, right? And the quantum wave function is a probabilistic matrix, right? It just tells you the probability that you'll observe an electron, for example, as having a particular value. And now all of the evidence for the quantum wave function is based on observations, right, outside of our brains, right? So, in particle colliders, in the double slit experiment. And so our evidence, much like in the Pac-Man world, suggests that everything outside of us obeys the same laws of physics. Well, in order to determine whether we have free will, I think, since I argue have reasons to think that our consciousness is analog, what we would need to do is to determine whether our quote unquote brains, right, in this world, really in our behavior, obeys the quantum wave function or not, right? So if at some point in the future, scientists can study to see whether our neurons, right, do obey the quantum wave function, or whether there are subtle violations of it that suggest that there is some kind of user intervening in our behavior, namely us, right? Then that could provide evidence, right, that in fact we do have free will that extends beyond this world, this simulated world in which we're in. Some free will that exists in that higher reference frame outside of the simulation.
I was wondering if I think this is super interesting, this idea of the holographic principle, because one of the first questions that comes to my mind is, if we are in fact living in a simulation, it seems like there would be some sort of physical, observable indication of that.
Mm-hmm.
And can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So the holographic principle has been proposed as a way of reconciling, right, the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, which aren't supposed to cooperate nicely with one another, because the theory of relativity is a classical theory that treats space and time as though they're analog, whereas quantum mechanics, right, treats everything as quantized, right? And so, some theorists have posited that the way to reconcile quantum mechanics and relativity is by positing this so-called holographic principle, which is that everything in our world, all objects like you and I, right, are holographic projections, right, of digital information on what's called the cosmological horizon, right? So if you even think about like Plato's cave, right? Plato gives this famous allegory where our world is a world of shadows projected by light behind us, right? And the holographic principle says that our world really is something like that we are all holographic projections, right? And that by understanding us as, and everything around us as holographic projections, that it's possible to explain how what appears to be a classical space and time is emergent from a kind of digital or quantized cosmological boundary.
You mentioned at the end of the paper that I read about some predictions that if the peer-to-peer hypothesis is true, then there are some things that we ought to confirm. Can you go over those? Like, if this is true, we've gone over for some reasons why it might be true, and then the things that it explains.
Yeah.
What should we expect to see?
Good. So let me remember. So one thing I talked about is this was a long time ago. Lattice quantum chromodynamics, right, which says that that quantum phenomena should have a certain kind of lattice-like structure, right? Sort of like crystals have lattices to them, right? And so if we were to find that kind of lattice-like structure in reality, then that would be some evidence that we live in a simulation. A second thing that has been argued by, I think it's Lewis Gates or James, I'm trying to remember. He argues that that there's evidence in the equations of quantum mechanics themselves, of something like error correcting codes of the sort that are contained in, obviously, game programming. Now, so that's a couple of things I talked about in previous work. And I think that also if we did find violations of the quantum wave function in human brains and behavior, that would also be reason to think that there is some kind of higher emergent reference frame in which we're controlling our actions in this reference frame, right? But more recently, a year or so ago, a game programmer, this fellow Ben Hoyt, who's the founder and CEO at 47 Games, reached out to me, and he said he'd actually read my work on this, and he said, you know, this is what we do when we program game engines for physics. And so this is sort of what I was talking about with you and the group at the APA meeting. Right? So he said, well, you know, what we do when we program peer-to-peer games is we need to resolve errors or divergences, right, between nodes to make sure that they represent what is called a believable world, right? So if I appeared to observe a bullet on my left, and you, and from your perspective, observed it on my right, that would be a big problem. We wouldn't have a believable world. And so he described to me the ways in which they program networks to resolve these kinds of issues, and used a technique called, well, there's a bunch of techniques that I talk about in a new paper that I'm currently drafting that involve, first of all, what's called dead reckoning, or correcting for drift away from a central tendency, right? Which can be done either through triangulation, like is done in actual navigation for boats and ships, right? But that in game programming, they use smooth curves, right? It's like what are called Catmull-Rom spleens, right? And those curves have particular types of properties, mathematical properties. And so what I argue actually in the newest paper is that those properties of Catmull-Rom spleens and dead reckoning actually correspond very, very closely to the actual shape and properties of the quantum wave function in our world. And so if I'm right, actually observation of the quantum wave function in our world is evidence that we live in a simulation. Its very properties are the kind of properties we would expect if we were in a game programmed utilizing this particular programming method. Now, on top of that, right, part of what's involved too are things called projective velocity blending and projective path blending. So when two computers represent something in slightly different positions, they try to correct for one another by blending, right, where they represent the object as being. Now, one of the interesting things that we know from the double slit experiment in quantum mechanics is when the quote unquote quantum waves overlap, right, according to the equations, what you have in the double slit experiment is destructive wave interference. And this is when two waves essentially cancel each other out. Now, if you think about the process of how that occurs, essentially what's going on is a blending of the properties of the waves. And so if I'm right, or this account is right, then the kinds of observations that we've had already in the double slit experiment are also evidence that the simulation has been programmed in precisely this kind of way, to blend object trajectories, right, to make our reality at a macro level, at a large level, believable. That's a long way of saying that I do think that there are some future ways that might give us additional evidence. But if I'm right, a lot of the strange things that we have already observed are evidence that we live in a simulation.
I'm curious, and you don't have to name names or anything like this, but I'm curious about the reception of this idea, because, you know, it's one thing for me to like argue about some historical minutia that no one really cares about, right? But it's another thing. This is a pretty far out there idea. It's pretty radical. In your experience with the conferences that you've presented at and with the papers that you've published, what has been the general amongst philosophers, the general reception, then amongst the general public as well?
Yeah. I'd like to say that, I'd like to say that the paper's gotten a lot of attention, or at least the stuff that I've published so far. Unfortunately, that's not the case, right? It has been discussed a little bit, and I've had mathematicians and computer scientists reach out to me, and I had a couple computer scientists like Eric Grange develop the ideas further. And I've presented it at physics conferences, and I always get good questions that I feel like I have some good answers to. But as of now, right, it's not anything like an established theory. I'm hoping that the new paper, right, that talk about dead reckoning and velocity and path blending in explaining the quantum wave function itself will hopefully get more attention, because it really sort of aims to hammer out the details, right? The earlier works were sort of just explaining how we can get sort of general types of quantum phenomena, but not the particular details of the quantum wave function and of the double slit experiment. And there's another thought experiment too called Wigner's friend thought experiment that the new account explains as well. So that's my hope, that I'll publish this new paper soon, and hopefully it'll get more attention, maybe as a result of your video, right, and our discussion.
We'll see.
It can take time, and
yeah.
I'm hopeful.
So tell everybody a little bit about where they can find out more information about you, specifically this argument, and then general books, articles, websites, whatever that you would recommend if somebody's interested in learning more.
Sure. So you can find information about me at www.marcusarvan.net. That's www.marcus, as in Victor, A, N as in nurse, .net. I'm also available on philpapers.org. All of my work can be downloaded there. In terms of good stuff to read, here are some things that I would suggest. There's my 2013 paper, A New Theory of Free Will, 2014 paper, A Unified Explanation of Quantum Phenomena, The Case for the Peer-to-Peer Simulation Hypothesis. Tom Campbell and a few physicists have a paper on testing the simulation theory that is interesting. Nina Emery published a paper last year in Philosophical Studies called Quantum Correlations and the Explanatory Power of Radical Metaphysical Hypotheses, where she references my work and develops a simulation account of quantum phenomena too. Eric Grange, a computer programmer, he's got a page called the Mesh World, P2P Hypothesis, where he discusses something called adaptive partition meshes, where different nodes in a peer-to-peer network trade off how much computing power they use to make it more efficient. And he argues that's partly what explains relativistic phenomena. So it's, again, Mesh World P2P Hypothesis. And Brian Whitworth has been arguing for a long time that the world is a physical reality, a virtual reality. He's got a paper called The Physical World as a Virtual Reality.
And I will link Marcus's website along with some of the other links that he sent me in the description of this video. By all means, check it out. It's some really great stuff. And I just want to thank you once again, Marcus, for taking time out of your day to come talk to us and explore this really interesting idea.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun. And obviously it was awesome to meet you, and I hope our paths cross again soon.